The chapter of my life in Fort Collins, Colorado, began with the kind of optimistic solitude that defines your early 20s. I was 24, living alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment that felt like a testament to my fledgling independence. The crisp, thin air of the Rockies felt invigorating, and the city with its charming old town and the pervasive scent of brewing coffee offered a perfect backdrop for starting anew. It was in one of those local coffee shops, a cozy haunt called the Bean Cycle, where my path first crossed with Alyssa's. A mutual friend, Sam, introduced us casually one afternoon, and from that moment, the trajectory of my life was subtly, irrevocably, altered. Alyssa possessed a quiet, magnetic allure. She wasn't boisterous or overtly outgoing. Her appeal was in her serene demeanor and a palpable sense of mystery. She was sweet, with a gentle laugh that seemed reserved for rare moments, and strikingly attractive in a way that felt classic yet undefined. Our initial courtship unfolded like a montage from a pleasant indie film. We spent evenings curled on my second-hand couch watching obscure documentaries, hiked the dusty trails of Horsetooth Rock as the sun set the foothills ablaze in orange and purple, and shared stories over craft beer at local breweries. It was all wonderfully, reassuringly normal. However, the first fissures in this idyllic facade began to appear gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. Alyssa was a fortress when it came to her past. Any inquiry about her family, her childhood, or her life before Colorado was met with a deftly deployed deflection or a quiet, somber dismissal. She claimed to be estranged from her family, offering a vague, "we just don't talk anymore," as a conversation ender. I, wanting to be the understanding boyfriend, attributed it to a painful history she wasn't ready to revisit. I respected her privacy, but the complete void where her history should have been created a subtle imbalance in our relationship. My world was an open book to her. She knew my friends, my routines, my apartment, while hers remained a locked room. More disquieting than her secretive past were her evolving behaviors. I began to notice the intensity of her gaze. Sometimes during our quiet moments, I would glance up from a book to find her already looking at me, her eyes holding an expression I couldn't decipher, a mixture of profound study and something else, something colder, like a geologist examining a specimen. I'd chuckle and ask what she was thinking about, and she'd simply smile a faint, closed-lipped smile and say, "Nothing, just you." The words should have been endearing, but the delivery carried an unsettling weight. This unease escalated with her patterns of visitation. She began showing up at my apartment unannounced. It started innocuously enough, a surprise coffee drop-off, but soon evolved into more intrusive appearances. I'd return from grocery shopping to find her car already in my parking lot, or I'd glance out my living room window late at night and see her sitting behind the wheel, parked across the street, engine off, lights dead. When I questioned her about it, she'd offer the same shrug and a rehearsed line about simply missing me and enjoying the spontaneity. My rational mind scrambled for excuses. She was lonely, deeply infatuated, perhaps a little socially awkward. But my primal instinct, the gut-deep alarm bell we're taught to ignore in polite society, was clanging loudly. The night I saw her at 3 a.m. became a definitive turning point. Stirred from a fitful sleep by a nameless anxiety, I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. A sliver of movement outside caught my eye. There, shrouded in the deep blue darkness of the unlit street, was her familiar sedan. And there she was, a stark silhouette against the dim glow of a distant streetlight, motionless and staring directly at my window. A cold dread, visceral and immediate, coiled in my stomach. This was no longer affectionate attachment, this was surveillance. I retreated back to bed, my heart hammering against my ribs, and spent the remaining hours of the night wrestling with a fear I couldn't yet justify. The next day, when I cautiously broached the subject, her reaction was the most frightening part yet. She seemed amused, almost dismissive, as if my concern was a peculiar and endearing quirk. Her ability to normalize the profoundly abnormal left me feeling isolated and confused, successfully gaslighting me into downplaying my own terror. The climax arrived a week later. I returned from a long day at work, my mind cluttered with mundane tasks, to find her perched on the concrete steps leading to my apartment door. She was a portrait of agitation, knees bouncing, fingers twisting together, a stark contrast to her usual placid composure. Before I could even utter a greeting, she sprang to her feet, her eyes wide and insistent. "You need to come with me. Right now," she demanded, her voice tight with an urgency that felt entirely foreign. "Whoa, Alyssa, what's going on? Come inside and talk to me," I said, my hand tightening on my keys. "There's no time," she insisted, her gaze darting toward her car parked at the curb. "Please, just get in the car. It's important. I'll explain on the way." Every fiber of my being, every subconscious signal I had been collecting for weeks, screamed in unified opposition. The image of her staring from the car, the cryptic intensity, the complete lack of context, it all coalesced into a single, clear command: do not get in that car. My refusal was firm. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what this is about. The transformation in her face was instantaneous and chilling. The nervous energy evaporated, replaced by a flat, cold anger that reached her eyes. The mask had finally slipped, and what lay beneath was terrifying in its emptiness. Without another word of argument or pleading, she turned on her heel, marched to her car, and sped away, leaving me shaken and utterly bewildered on my doorstep. The pieces began falling into place 2 days later via a single cryptic text from an unknown number. Stay away from Alyssa. She's not who you think she is. The message was a digital ice bath. My frantic replies yielded nothing but silence. Calls to Alyssa's phone went straight to voicemail. The anxiety that had been simmering for weeks now boiled over into full-blown panic. That same night, the footsteps outside my door confirmed my worst fears. Hearing the faint jiggle of my doorknob being tested in the dead of night was a feeling of vulnerability I will never forget. Peering through the blinds, I saw her not alone, but retreating to a nondescript sedan where 2 shadowy figures waited. A silent, terrifying confirmation that this was far bigger than just her. The next morning, armed with a cold dread and desperate for answers, I embarked on a digital deep dive. Superficially, her social media was a bland collection of scenic photos and memes. But when I dug deeper, searching her name beyond the first page of results, I unearthed a nightmare buried in a local Nebraska news archive. Her name wasn't Alyssa, it was Leah. The article detailed the breakup of a kidnapping ring in Omaha that used young women as bait to lure victims into cars. Leah's photograph, with darker hair and a harder expression but undeniably her, stared back at me from the screen. She had been arrested but released due to lack of evidence. The article noted the group was believed to have relocated. She hadn't just moved to Colorado. She had fled, reinvented herself, and continued her horrific trade. The revelation was suffocating. My relationship, the dates, the hikes, the quiet moments, it had all been a meticulously crafted lie, a long con designed to lull me into a false sense of security before I was delivered to whatever fate they had planned. I called the police, my voice trembling as I relayed the entire sordid story. They filed a report and offered the standard advice: be vigilant, lock your doors, avoid contact. For days I lived in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every creak in my building, analyzing every car that passed. Just as the initial shock began to dull into a constant low hum of anxiety, the second text arrived from another new number. You shouldn't have told the police. Big mistake. The message was a declaration of war. They knew I knew, and they knew I had talked. That was the final straw. I packed a bag immediately and fled to a friend's house in Loveland. But even there, surrounded by support, I felt exposed. Every set of headlights was a threat. I never heard from Leah directly again, but months later a news article from Fort Collins provided a grim form of closure. 3 individuals, including a woman named Leah, had been arrested after a failed abduction attempt on a CSU student. A witness had intervened and a police search of their phones revealed a digital hit list, photos, addresses, and routines of potential targets. My name and address were on it. They had been planning for weeks, and my last-minute refusal to get in the car had been the only thing that saved me. I left Colorado soon after, the majestic beauty of the Rockies forever tainted by association. Now, in a quiet town in Idaho, I am physically safe, but psychologically scarred. The experience didn't just teach me to be cautious, it fundamentally rewired my understanding of trust and safety. The world feels different when you know, with absolute certainty, that evil doesn't always announce itself with a snarl. Sometimes it arrives with a sweet smile, a quiet laugh, and a patient, predatory gaze, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The terror of realizing how close I came to vanishing without a trace is a ghost that never leaves me, a permanent resident in the quiet corners of my mind, reminding me that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. A narrow escape, luck, intuition, and the predator in plain sight. The stories our parents tell us from their youth often serve as windows into their formative years, revealing not only their character but the texture of the world they navigated. Some stories are fond reminiscences, others are cautionary tales, etched with a permanent tremor in the voice that speaks of a narrowly avoided catastrophe. The incident that happened to my mother when she was 19 is firmly of the latter category, A harrowing account of trust exploited, intuition ignored, and ultimately, salvation delivered by the mundane rhythms of everyday life. It is a story that underscores how perilously close ordinary days can come to tragedy, and how fragile the line between safety and peril truly is. Fresh into her summer vacation from college and eager to earn her own keep, my mother found employment at a small, unassuming PCO and STD call office. This was an era before the ubiquity of mobile phones, when such booths were vital connective tissue for communities. This particular office was a modest operation, a single room with a glass front that offered a clear view of the street, making it feel both public and exposed. It didn't require many employees. In fact, most days my mother worked entirely alone. The owner, whose primary business was real estate, operated from a larger, connected main office but was rarely seen, preferring the seclusion of his cabin. This isolation, though initially peaceful, would become a key factor in the unease that was to follow. Her routine was simple, morning until early evening, managing calls and the ledger. The quiet hours were filled with study or contemplation, the predictable pattern broken only by the occasional customer. One such afternoon, a man walked in. He was, by her recollection, in his late 50s, with a distinguished head of white hair and a matching beard. He was dressed neatly in a navy blue shirt, presenting an image of mature respectability. He went to the booth, made his call, and conducted his business. Nothing seemed amiss. It was only after he had finished that the situation began its subtle, sinister shift. He approached her desk and initiated a conversation that, on the surface, was merely friendly small talk. He asked if she was related to the boss, a common enough question in small businesses. When she said no, the tone of the conversation pivoted. He began to lavish her with compliments, commenting on her beauty and her educated demeanor. Flattery is a powerful tool, especially for a young woman in a new job, and it effectively disarmed initial caution. Then he presented the bait. He told her she was too talented for such a small office and that he could easily secure her a position at a popular bank nearby. Boasting of his connections, he introduced himself, a name now lost to time and trauma, and then issued the critical invitation. He told her to bring her resume to his home later that day to discuss her education and prospects further. This was the first major red flag, and my mother's intuition flared. A private residence was an inappropriate venue for a job interview, especially one arranged minutes prior with a complete stranger. Yet, the man was adept at assuaging these nascent fears. He expertly wove a narrative of normalcy and safety into his request. He mentioned his ailing father and the live-in servant who cared for them both, creating an image of a bustling, multi-generational household where a young woman would not be alone with him. He pointed out his building directly across the road, a relatively new upscale apartment complex inhabited by wealthy families. This physical proximity to her place of work somehow made the proposition feel less threatening. It was not a distant, unknown location, but a visible, seemingly safe one. Crucially, he advised her not to mention their conversation to anyone at the office, a request that at the time felt reasonable to my mother. She didn't want her current boss to think she was already planning her departure. This manipulation of her professional courtesy was a masterstroke, effectively cutting off a potential avenue of warning or intervention. Trusting this constructed facade of respectability, she agreed. That evening, after her shift, she crossed the road and entered the building's compound. Her first jolt of confusion came immediately. The man was there, but the distinguished gentleman with white hair was gone. In his place stood a man with hair and beard dyed a stark shoe polish black, now dressed in a simple t-shirt. The transformation was jarring, a bizarre and inexplicable act of reinvention that happened in the span of a few hours. Before she could process this, he waved. He was standing next to a middle-aged woman and two young children in school uniforms, a tableau of domestic normality. He introduced my mother to the woman with a casual friendliness that suggested a long acquaintance, leading her to believe this was his wife and children. The presence of this family unit was the final reassurance she didn't know she needed, effectively silencing her remaining doubts. They all entered the building together. The elevator ride was a piece of psychological theater. The man pressed the button for his floor. When the elevator stopped on the 4th or 5th floor, the woman and children got out. My mother, assuming this was their destination, began to follow, but the woman chuckled and told her, "No, dear, this isn't it." The man remained inside. In that moment, the carefully constructed narrative of his family life crumbled. This woman was not his wife. She was merely a neighbor, a stranger. My mother was now alone in an elevator with him, ascending to the 9th floor. He filled the silence with talk of his job in Dubai, of his life abroad, a story designed to impress and distract. When the doors opened on the 9th floor, the scene was ordinary. A square corridor with 2 doors on each side, 3 children playing in the common area. He walked to the door closest to the elevator, unlocked it, and invited her in. The ordinariness of the children playing was a powerful disincentive to panic. Surely nothing bad could happen in a home with the sound of children's laughter just outside the door. Inside, the living room was clean but sparsely furnished. An L-shaped sofa, a television, and on a side table, a teapot with a cold drink bottle next to it. Most striking, and confirming her observation about his hair, was an open packet of hair dye with a brush as if hastily discarded. He asked if she minded him closing the door. This was the second critical moment. Despite her growing unease, my mother, mustering all her politeness, a social conditioning that too often overrides self-preservation, said she would prefer it open. To her relief, he complied. He then offered to show her the house, a strange prelude to a job discussion. She agreed, and he led her through a doorway into a small, dark passage. The entire rest of the apartment was shrouded in darkness. He opened a door on the left, announcing it as the bedroom. She peered into the gloom. A bed, closed windows, and something that made her blood run cold. A camera stand positioned directly in front of the bed. There was no sign of an ailing father, no servant. When she asked, his excuse was flimsy and immediate. They had taken his father to the doctor. This directly contradicted his earlier assurance that they would be home, and the lie was now undeniable. Fear, cold and sharp, finally began to eclipse politeness. She insisted they return to the living room to talk about the job. He retrieved a chair and sat directly in front of her, a physical blocking of her path to the open door. He then offered her the cold drink from the bottle, insisting when she refused. He disappeared into the dark interior, perhaps a kitchen, and returned with 2 filled glasses, pressuring her to take a sip. She held the glass but did not drink, a small act of defiance. His conversation meandered back to Dubai, to the strict laws there, and then the mask slipped entirely. To demonstrate the punishment for thieves, he suddenly grabbed her hand, mimicking the cutting of an arm. The violation of that unnecessary touch was electric. It was no longer a suggestion of threat. It was the threat itself, made physical. In that heart-stopping moment, she knew she was in profound danger. He stood up and moved casually toward the door, talking about automatic doors in his Dubai flat, his body now blocking her only exit. Her mind raced. The playing children outside would be no help. She was trapped, and she knew it. She believes to this day that it was a silent, desperate prayer that was answered next. Across the corridor, the other 2 apartment doors opened simultaneously. 2 women, the mothers of the children, stepped out to call them in. They saw each other and began chatting right there in the hallway, their conversation creating a pool of normalcy just feet from the predator's door. This was her chance. The man was distracted. In a flash of clarity, she stood, moved to the doorway, and blurted out the first excuse that came to mind. "I'm getting late, and I need to get home on time, or my mom will kill me." It was a lie infused with the relatable panic of a teenager, and it worked. She didn't wait for the elevator but fled down 9 flights of stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. He called after her, but she shouted a promise to meet him tomorrow, another lie, and didn't stop running until she was safely home. Shaken and ashamed, she told no one. The next day, she was terrified to go to work, but she did. Incredibly, her normally reclusive boss emerged from his office and asked, point blank, if she had met that man. When she cautiously admitted she had, he asked if the man had behaved inappropriately. She said no, but his warning was stern and clear. Stay away from him. He is not a nice man. Don't go with him anywhere or visit his place. He never explained how he knew, leaving a permanent mystery. Was the man a known entity? Had the boss seen him loitering? We will never know. The man, however, was not done. That evening, he was waiting outside his building. He saw her and sent his servant, a younger, faster man, to intercept her. The servant tried to cajole her into speaking with his employer, but my mother refused, flagging down a taxi and escaping again. She left the job shortly after, her vacation nearly over, grateful for the excuse. The story could have ended there, a scary anecdote from her youth. But its true, horrifying conclusion came years later. My mother, then married, was reading the newspaper when she saw a familiar face staring back from the crime pages. It was him, older but unmistakable. He had been arrested in a different city for drugging and sexually assaulting a young woman. The article detailed his modus operandi, luring victims with promises of jobs, recording the assaults, and using the footage for blackmail. He had a history of such crimes. The report noted that all his known victims were in their early 20s, her exact age at the time of their encounter. The realization was a visceral blow. The camera stand in the dark room, the insistence on the drink he likely intended to drug, the predatory grab of her hand. Every chilling detail snapped into a horrifying life-and-death context. The sheer randomness of her salvation, those two women choosing that exact moment to step out and chat, was what separated her life from the tragic fates of his other victims. She had not been clever or brave. She had been lucky. It was a humbling and terrifying truth that she carried silently for decades, a secret shadow from her past, only shared with me recently. It is a story that speaks not of a victory of wits, but of the fragile, incredible grace of chance, and a stark reminder of the predators who hide in the plainest sight, armed with nothing more than plausible stories and malicious intent. This story is for Jessica. It happened 20 years ago, and I tell it now in her memory. 2 years after our parents divorced, I left our mother's house to live with our dad and Jessica in rural southern Maine. His property was large, surrounded by thick forests. The house was a 2-story building with a basement, an attic, and a wraparound porch. It had been designed for our stepmother, a deeply unpleasant woman who tormented us throughout our childhood with psychological cruelty and occasional physical punishments. Our visits there were dreaded events. Thankfully, our dad divorced her during my junior year of high school. Jessica moved in with him immediately after. I waited until I graduated to join them. I hoped the house would feel different without our stepmother, but I quickly realized something was still wrong. My bedroom was next to Jessica's on the 2nd floor. Her room was the only access point to the dark, unfinished attic, a space we seldom entered. Shortly after I moved in, we began hearing strange noises from above at night. It started as small, hurried footsteps scampering across the attic floor. We nervously joked about gnomes, blaming the sounds on imaginary creatures. Our dad dismissed it, assuring us it was rats or squirrels, but the activity grew more frequent and troubling. The footsteps were just the beginning. Doors began opening randomly throughout the house. I would be reading or watching TV in the living room and hear a faint creak followed by the slow squeak of a door swinging open upstairs. Every time I checked, I found an empty hallway and no explanation. One particular evening is forever etched in my memory. Jessica and I were watching TV downstairs. Around midnight, she yawned and went to bed. I stayed on the couch, engrossed in a show. About 10 minutes later, I clearly heard footsteps descending the staircase. Thinking it was Jessica, I didn't pay attention until I heard the basement door clack open. Confused, I stood and walked toward the hallway. I called out to see if she needed anything. Silence answered. My heart beat faster as I leaned forward and flipped the basement light switch. The stairs were illuminated, but nobody was there. Feeling uneasy, I closed the basement door and double-checked the latch. Now unsettled, I decided to go to bed. My bedroom door was tricky, pinched against the frame from settling. It required a firm tug to close. That night, I made sure to pull it tight and secure it shut. I left my window slightly open for air, trying to convince myself everything was fine. Sometime after 1 a.m., I was startled awake by footsteps again. They were louder now, moving quickly up the wooden staircase. I sat frozen, listening as they moved down the hallway toward Jessica's room. Her door creaked open loudly, then slammed shut moments later. My heart raced. Suddenly, the footsteps hurried back toward my room. Something slammed forcefully into my door, rattling it violently against its frame. Terrified, I jumped out of bed, standing breathless with panic. The footsteps swiftly retreated, rushing back toward Jessica's room. I heard her attic door open forcefully, followed by hurried steps running up into the attic. The footsteps raced across the attic floor directly above me toward the small window overlooking the porch roof. A loud, heavy thud echoed from outside as if something had landed on the shingles. Shaking with fear, I ran to my window, slammed it shut, and locked it. I peered out, but saw only darkness and moonlight. A few seconds later, I heard Jessica's shaky voice at my door. "Are you messing with me?" she asked anxiously. I opened the door quickly, relieved to see her. "No, are you messing with me?" I replied, my voice trembling. She shook her head rapidly. She told me the violent banging on my door had jolted her awake. Afterward, she heard her bedroom door and the attic door open rapidly, followed by the running footsteps. Terrified, she had stayed hidden under her blankets until it went quiet. Neither of us slept that night. We sat together on my bed, waiting for sunrise. The next day, we confronted our dad. He brushed it off, still convinced it was animals and old house noises. Frustrated, we took matters into our own hands. We installed a sturdy lock on the attic door. From that day on, we both locked our bedroom doors every night, and I stopped opening my window after dark. The extreme activity gradually faded. We occasionally still heard strange creaks or faint footsteps, but nothing as violent ever happened again. Yet, a sense of unease lingered. We both felt watched whenever we were home alone. About a year later, our dad announced he planned to sell the house. Jessica and I were thrilled. Despite the property, neither of us felt safe there anymore. A young family purchased it, seemingly unaware of its history. We packed up quickly, relieved to move on. Our new home was closer to town, smaller and simpler. From the first night, it was peaceful and quiet, entirely free from strange occurrences. Life returned to normal. Years later, I mentioned our experiences to a longtime neighbor. She hesitated but revealed that before our father bought the land, it belonged to a troubled, reclusive old woman. She was known for unstable behavior and violent outbursts. She had died mysteriously decades earlier in the old cottage originally on the property. Locals whispered that her ghost lingered, though our father had dismissed the stories. The memories still send chills through me. Jessica and I rarely discussed it, preferring to leave it in the past. I share it now for her, My entry into the Morales family's life began in February 2020. I was juggling a part-time admin job at a small logistics company in Lakewood. My boss, Mark, was exceptionally kind, allowing flexible hours which enabled me to take on babysitting to pay down student loans. That's how I found Jonathan Morales. He was a single father. His wife had passed a year earlier in a car accident, leaving him to raise their 4-year-old daughter, Bella. He worked long hours at an IT firm and needed reliable evening care. Bella was bright and inquisitive, with an impressive vocabulary. She loved coloring and her stuffed animals, and she always greeted me with a joyful smile. On the night of March 4th, Jonathan rushed out around 6 p.m., apologizing for a late work night that would likely stretch past midnight. I assured him we were fine. Bella and I had our usual evening of dinner, playing with blocks and watching a show. She was especially affectionate, seeking extra hugs, which I attributed to her missing her dad. After her bath at 8:30, I tucked her into her room, with its glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, read a story, and said goodnight. About 30 minutes later, as I watched TV downstairs, her voice called out. I found her standing by her window, pointing at the glass, her expression anxious. "There was a man outside," she said, her voice trembling. "He was staring at me." I looked out but saw only the dark, empty backyard lit by a single motion-activated light. Our neighborhood was quiet and safe, not the place for loiterers. But Bella was genuinely scared, so I closed the curtains completely and reassured her before she lay down. I returned downstairs uneasy. Bella wasn't prone to making up stories. I double-checked all the locks, trying to convince myself it was a shadow or an animal. I resumed watching TV, but the volume stayed low, my nerves on edge. Less than 15 minutes later, a frightened, urgent cry echoed from upstairs. This was no whimper, it was pure terror. My heart pounding, I sprinted up to find her sitting up in bed, tears streaking her face. "He's back," she sobbed. "He's looking at me." The curtains were still drawn, but a sliver of darkness was visible between them. I hugged her. Her fear was too real and laid her down. A surge of protective anger cut through my fear. I needed to check outside. I went to the kitchen and grabbed a large knife. It felt like an overreaction, but it was a tangible form of defense. I stepped into the cold night. The motion light flicked on, illuminating the deserted yard. I walked the perimeter, checking windows and behind bins. I found nothing. Relieved, I came back inside and locked the door, the deadbolt clicking shut with finality. The sound that followed was immediate and violent, a loud, aggressive jiggling of the front door handle. Time seemed to freeze. My heart hammered against my ribs. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was dark, but I could see him, a tall man in dirty jeans and a stained hoodie. His hair was matted and his eyes had a wild, frantic energy. He began banging on the door, rocking it on its hinges. I shouted through the door, my voice shaking, "I'm calling the police, leave now!" The banging stopped for a second, then the handle jiggled again with even more force. He was trying to break in. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. I gasped out the address to the operator. Upon hearing me, the man suddenly darted away. I stayed on the line, frozen, until police lights flashed outside. My hands shook so badly I could barely unlock the door for them. Bella ran downstairs and clung to my leg, sobbing. The officers searched the property. One shouted from the side of the house. They had found a man crouched under a bush, glaring with confused hostility. They handcuffed him and led him away. After taking my statement, an officer explained the man had escaped a mental health facility that day. He was considered dangerous and unpredictable. Jonathan arrived home an hour later, alarmed. He hugged Bella tightly, apologizing to us both, though it wasn't his fault. He was just grateful she was safe. The police left. Bella, exhausted, fell asleep in her father's room. I couldn't shake the image of the man's silhouette. It still gives me chills to remember Bella's certainty and how he was waiting out there. Years later, a strange noise at night still brings me back to that house in Denver. The worst part is not knowing why he chose us. Sometimes I wonder if he remembers that night, or if we were just fleeting figures in his confusion.